Good evening, and welcome to this important discussion here on BlackDoctor.org. I am Ellis Dean, the Director of Digital Programming and Production. And I will say this, normally when we have these Facebook Live discussions, we're talking about some sort of illness. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about COVID, and we've talked about diabetes and all of these different illnesses and ailments that affect Black and brown people disproportionately. But tonight we're going to be talking about a solution to getting better medications, to getting better treatments for our community. And tonight we're talking about clinical trials. And so I know that those are some words that have been buzzing around lately, especially with COVID and how the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. But what really are clinical trials, and how important are they in the development of better medications, better treatments for any type of ailment? And most importantly, why aren't more Black and brown people involved in these clinical trials? And so we're going to have we've got a wonderful guest with us tonight to really kind of delve into that topic and explore it and get to the bottom of it as to what clinical trials are and how can we get more Black people involved. And so first up, we've got Dr. Keith Crawford. He is not a stranger to BlackDoctor.org. He works at the NIH. He works infectious diseases, primarily with AIDS. But he has been, if there's somebody that I go to that knows about clinical trials, it's Dr. Crawford.
And I've been writing for Black Doctor for a long time.
He's been in the game articles on the site. Yes, sir. I trust Dr. Crawford all the way to the end. And of course, our newest friend is Dr. Yolanda Lewis Ragland. She is a pediatrician, but let me tell you something. She's not just a pediatrician. She is also double board certified. She's certified in obesity or
obesity medicine. Mm-hmm.
Obesity. She runs clinics. She's been all over the world. I just want to say around the world, and she did. And so with her extensive background, she has to know what clinical trials are. She has to be involved in clinical research in order to better serve both her populations, pediatrics and women, people living with obesity. And so I asked both of them to come and take part in this discussion tonight and really kind of get to the bottom of why we can't get Black people involved in clinical trials. So before we get started, I want to ask you to do a couple of things for me. First and foremost, let us know where you're watching from. So put that in the comment section and just say, hey, drop your city and state, where you're watching us from. We'd like to know where people are watching us from. Number two, if you think there's somebody that you know that might need this information, make sure you share it. Let them know this information is out there so they can get some clarification and get some real information and not that misinformation or disinformation that's kind of swirling around on the internet. And finally, we want you to ask questions. And so if you have some questions, make sure you drop those in the comment section and we will get to them either during the program or at the end of the program. We will ask those questions. We want your questions. This show is interactive and this show is about getting your questions answered. So we've done all the housekeeping. First question I'm going to ask, I'm going to throw it to you, Dr. Crawford. What is a clinical trial?
Very important question. So first of all, a clinical trial involves human participants. So this is research that involves human participants. And when we hear the term trial, that tells us there's an intervention. That tells us you're going to get something or we're going to do something to you. It's an intervention that's involved. That intervention could be a medication or a treatment. It could be a surgical procedure, or it could be a medical device. It could also be a consultation with a pharmacist. It also could be accessing services from a social worker. So you're going to get some type of intervention. So clinical trials require an intervention. Now, we want to see how effective this intervention is for a disease or disease management. So we usually compare. We want to compare different interventions. And we either compare it with whatever the standard of care is, or if there is no standard of care, we may compare it with a placebo. We've all heard of that. And so if there's a comparison, we say this is a controlled trial. It's controlled. There's an intervention, and we're going to compare it with another intervention. If that other intervention happens to be a placebo, which is essentially not an intervention, we say it's a placebo-controlled trial. Okay? Now, how do we determine which group you get in? How do you get into the treatment, the active treatment, or the placebo group, or the alternative treatment? How do we determine? The best way to do it is through what we call a randomization. That means you are randomly assigned to a group. That means you are just as likely to receive one treatment as you are the other treatment. And that's very important, because if I'm a doctor doing a research study, which I have done research studies, and I don't want to pick all the healthiest people and put them in the treatment group and then put all the sicker people in the placebo group. No, it needs to be randomized. You're equally likely to be in one group or the other. The chances are equal. But in many studies, you're not going to know what group you're in. Sometimes you will. We call that open label. You know what treatment group you're in. But in some instances, you do not know which treatment group you're in, which is a blinded study. I don't know which drug I'm getting. I don't know whether I'm getting the placebo or not. And then if neither I know or the doctor running the study knows, it's double blinded. Neither of us know which treatment I'm receiving. The only one who knows is the research pharmacist who set up the study. So I'm going to stop for a minute because that's a lot to digest. There are a lot of layers. But the key point is that a clinical trial is human subjects, human participant research where you receive an intervention. And it could be a drug or medication, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a consultation. And you could be randomized to receive one treatment or another. Okay. And I think that's a lot. So
it is a lot. And so we've already got some feedback. So Dr. Yolanda, talk to us. The first question is, we hear all that and we got a response from Teresa that says, that doesn't sound safe. So help us understand how clinical trials and why clinical trials are safe.
Okay, so good. That's good. A good question. A good place to start. So first of all, anything that we do, I love to start by telling people that medicine is as much an art as it is a science. And when we graduate, when we get that that degree in science, it's actually arts and sciences. So we are still learning things at time, and we have to do trial and error. Even when I decide to give a particular prescription for, say, something, everything that works doesn't always work on all people all the time, right? There's the reason we do acetaminophen as well as ibuprofen. Some people respond better to one than the other. So we've been doing trials and just figuring out how people respond to things since the beginning of the time, and it's not going to end. This is just, it's the way medicine is practiced, right? So one of the things to know that makes it extremely safe is that we have review boards, right? There's something called the IRB. It's a review board, investigative review board. They're responsible for giving us guidelines a lot of these trials will start with non-human participants first. So what Dr. Crawford told you was kind of toward the end of when we look at a medication or a treatment or some sort. We actually start with non-human And then we'll go to human. We usually go to a healthy population, just like with the Pfizer and the Moderna and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. We started with a healthy adult population before we got to children, because we want to protect the most vulnerable. So we don't start it on very old and very young. We started on, we start anything that we're going to do on a healthy population, but it's safer than it sounds. It takes a while. We have review boards. We have very stringent precautions. You have to report pretty much every single thing that happens. It's just like with this vaccine we've been talking about. There's the vaccine adverse reaction reporting system. We always report anything that happens. Review boards look at everything that we're doing. We have to say if this population has been consented. And as you know, as Dr. Crawford just spoke about, you sometimes have to consent to be a part of it, but agree not to know whether you're getting the placebo or the treatment. But prior to, and we all know the historical Tuskegee experiment, right? This is one of those reasons we had these conversations. That was a trial that was done without consenting individuals for changing something that happened in the trial. So basically understanding that while they were doing the trial, they figured out that penicillin treated syphilis, but they decided not to give that information to these individuals. So they kept doing something that in the end it was harmful without their consent and out their knowledge. That is unacceptable. There are now, things are in place. We all know about it. And so that is something that should not and would not happen again. But these are the reasons we have IRB, these investigative review boards, and we have protocols, and you have to do this reporting. There's cycles of reporting. You have to say how many people are still in the trial. Has anybody dropped out of the trial for any particular reason? Sometimes the reason is unrelated to sickness or illness. They just, they moved, or, they decided, they wanted to have a baby now and they didn't want to take this anymore. Whatever the case may be, there's always, but we give a lot of information, but it's still an art and a science. We're always going to have to sort of weigh these things out. My system is not going to respond exactly like Dr. Crawford's system, even though we're both African-American human beings. It may be because I'm a woman. It may just be because of my genetic, makeup from generations of where my family is from. We don't know. This is why we have to do these trials. So it is very important to do them.
Could I add just a couple things, and to follow up and echo what Dr. Ragland mentioned? The investigative review board, which approves, again, all of these clinical studies that approve. This is an independent board. They don't have any affiliation with the study. So there's nothing in it from them. These are doctors and nurses and social workers and other people, even people from the community that review the protocol. They make sure it is safe. That is the primary goal. To
and
make sure it is safe.
People that are involved in that as well. So they're looking at rights. They're looking that you have not violated someone's rights. They're looking. When he says doctors, we got to make sure people know. All walks of life are part of these review boards, because we're very, very careful about infringing on anyone's rights, doing anything that's unethical. All of those things are so important to us now.
And if it is a drug, if it's an investigational drug, if it's a new drug, the FDA has to approve it to even go into clinical trials. So when Dr. Ragland was talking about the animal studies and, we do what we call toxicology. We look at whether it could possibly cause cancer. We look at whether it could damage a fetus. All of these things are done in what we call preclinical. As she mentioned, a lot of this work is done in animals before it's even allowed to go into humans.
Mm-hmm. I think, it's important to stress, two words: informed consent, right? And so, from the end user side, when you are participating in a clinical trial, you sign a piece of paper that says informed consent, and that part of that information, and part of that is you can discontinue at any time for any reason if you're not comfortable in this trial. Mm-hmm. So, what is different about that today? And a lot of this talking about the IRBs, the informed consent, the independent reviews, all of those things, the legal, all of those things were born as a result of the Tuskegee, right?
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about these in clinical trials, understanding that all of these things now, because we understand how horrendous Tuskegee was, right? That we understand that, but as a result, all of these things are as a result of that Tuskegee study, and to make these trials safer. And so I want to kind of stress that, because I know with Black people, when we hear clinical trials, we say Tuskegee, right? And we go right to it. That's the first word that comes. It's like a word association. Clinical trials contains Tuskegee, but understanding there's been a lot of kind of safeguards put in place as a result of what happened with Tuskegee.
We have what was referred to as the Belmont Report, which was a report that looked at safety and ethics in clinical trials. And there were some other key, and these are international documents that look at clinical trial safety. So when Mr. Dean just mentioned the informed consent, that's exactly what it sounds like. You're giving your consent, but we're telling you up front, how could this treatment help you? How could this treatment harm you? What are we going to do if you have some problems as a result of participating in this trial? And by the way, as Mr. Dean mentioned, anytime you're sick and tired of this, you want to get out, you can get out. So the informed consent, which again, this process is overseen by the Institutional Review Board that Dr. Ragland mentioned, the IRB. This is very, very tightly regulated. And the key concern, primary, is safety. Secondarily is whether it's effective. But primarily, we as the researchers, we're concerned about whether it's effective. But primarily, from the regulatory aspect, we're concerned about the safety.
And one thing to know about the IRB is these reviews are very stringent. We need IRB consent for anything. It's not even about medications and trials. I do a study right now. I'm the primary investigator for a study that we are doing transcendental meditation. We're introducing transcendental meditation to individuals with heart disease, right? So heart health, heart disease, that's one of my, pet projects, because it's so tightly connected to the Black community, to Black women, to obesity, right? And now, of course, to COVID as well. And so we're looking at all kinds of interventions, because as Dr. Crawford knows, with the NIH studies and the Office of Minority Affairs, they basically let us know that 40% of African Americans have uncontrolled hypertension, regardless of all the medications that are out there. And there are various reasons. I do believe one of it, and it's about the fact that we don't, despite we're disproportionately burdened by heart disease, but only 2.5% of African Americans participate in clinical trials for heart disease treatments and medications. So we have very little representation, but in terms of the disease itself, we have a lot of representation, twice as much. We're only 14% of the population. We have about 23.5% of heart disease is in African Americans. Compare that to 75% of the population that's white, and they actually also have 23 point something like 7%. So statistically, it's not that much different, but 14% of the population and 75% of the population, and we have the same amount of heart disease. That's absurd. Right. But I'm doing a study now, and we are introducing transcendental meditation, which lowers blood pressure, lowers the risk of a heart attack and stroke, but it does some other great things when you talk about side effects, right? Cognition and better sleep. But I had to have an IRB review. I have to have approval. They have to know how many people were, is in the study. Do they know that this, what transcendental meditation is? Literally, but it's just like I'm given a medication, but I'm not given a medication. I'm only, introducing them to meditation, but it's that strict. It is anything that you introduce that could be a treatment of any sort, whether it's support groups, whether it's, like I said, meditation, whatever. These things require IRB approval. So that's how the pendulum has swung, is we are like way over here with safety now. It's not only about whether it works or not, as Dr. Crawford said.
So, Dr. Crawford, I'm going to ask this question because it's been brought up in the comment section. So first question I'm going to ask is from Denise, and she's saying, how can one be informed if it's a trial? So I want you to kind of help people understand that, how it's informed while it's a trial, trying to learn more about a treatment or an intervention. And then the second thing is, I want you to expand on what Dr. Ragland was talking about in terms of why is it important for Black people to be involved in these clinical trials?
Okay, so first of all, when you say how are you informed if it's a trial? It's a trial because we don't know what the outcome is. We think that we have, just like Dr. Ragland's study is excellent. She understands how transcendental meditation works. She wants to determine, can this help lower blood pressure, for example? She thinks that it can do that based on what she knows transcendental meditation can do, but there's no guarantee that it's going to work. So we don't know what the outcome is, and that's why we have to do the trial. What the informed consent will tell you, say, for example, we give you a medication. There could be a medication that we use to treat rheumatoid arthritis that we think will reduce seizures. So what's the informed consent going to do? It's going to tell you what this drug does. How safe is this drug? What are the side effects of this drug? Because that's what we know. It's also going to tell you what procedures we're going to use to monitor you. It's going to tell you how frequently you come in to the clinic. It's going to tell you what type of samples we're going to collect from you. Are we collecting blood samples? Are we collecting urine samples? It's going to tell you that type of stuff. And so, and it's going to give you an opportunity to ask questions. So that's the informed consent process. So now this question, which Dr. Ragland has already kind of alluded to, why is it important for Black people to participate in clinical trials? So there are a couple of reasons why. One, at the top of the list, is that there are differences between racial groups in how diseases progress and manifest. We call this pathogenesis of disease. So there are differences in how the disease kind of plays out in different groups of people. Give you an example. In breast cancer, many breast tumors express receptors for estrogen. That means they're sensitive to estrogen. The hormone estrogen drives the growth of that tumor. Well, if that's the case, if we find estrogen receptors in the tumor, we have treatments that can block the estrogen and kill the tumor. But African American women are less likely to have estrogen positive tumors. So we may have to treat that tumor differently. And so if we did not know that and we just assume that you're going to use the same treatment for everyone, that becomes a problem. So now then we move to the treatment. Different populations process drugs differently. We break down drugs differently. We distribute drugs in our tissues slightly differently. The example I love to use is hepatitis C. infection. Now I'm going to go back in history a little bit. We used to treat, thank God we used to treat hepatitis C with two drugs, interferon and ribavirin. Interferon and ribavirin. That's how we used to treat hepatitis C. Well, it turns out that African Americans are likely to have a genetic form of a protein that makes the interferon less effective in treating the virus, treating the hepatitis virus. And then for a double whammy, African Americans also have a genetic form of the protein. Not all of them, but some African Americans have a form that makes the ribavirin less effectively transported into the tissues that it needs to get into. It needs to get into the liver, it needs to be taken up and transported into the liver. And so the African Americans often have a form that doesn't transport the ribavirin into the liver as effectively. So that's a double whammy. These are two drugs that might not work as well in African Americans because we have genetic differences in terms of how we process the drugs. One final thing is that there are differences in what we call the social determinants of health. And these are non-biological, these are non-medical factors that affect health outcomes. Do I have medical insurance? Where do I live? How many people live in my household with me? How much money do I make? What type of transportation can I get to clinics and do the, get what I need? And we found that these social determinants of health were responsible for disparities in Black, Latinx, indigenous communities from COVID-19. We know that we had high rates of medical comorbidities that affected COVID, but also these other social determinants of health increased our chances of getting COVID and also dying from COVID. So these are not even medical factors, but these are factors that may be more prevalent in African American communities or Latinx communities. And we need to be able to tease this out when we do our clinical studies so we can come up with the most effective treatment for everybody.
And adding to that, because that was an excellent an answer. Adding to that, one of those social determinants of health are the biases, right? The unconscious biases. What a physician even thinks you might need when they see you. So how many Black and brown faces we're being offered monoclonal antibodies? Very few, right? How many in their communities even knew about monoclonal antibodies? So our survival rate was much lower because they weren't going to facilities that even had monoclonal antibodies. And if they did, they weren't being offered them. We all know the story of the Susan Moore, a physician who was asking by name for a medication that she knew she needed for the pain and was not given. So we're not just talking about your medical insurance and whether your health literacy. I mean, all of that stuff is huge. But even when you're literate, even when you know what you need, even when you show up and you can tell them and prescribe it for yourself, you're still not given the proper treatment because of the microaggressions and the bias and the blatant that's not I don't want to call that unconscious. That's a conscious racism. Bias, conscious bias. So we have all of those layers that we have to work through. So we have to be at the table. We have to be a part of these trials. And we actually have to be just like, we all know about Dr. Kinsey. We got to be a part of even, the creation of these things so that people will feel more comfortable.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to give a quick refresh. If you're just joining us, we are talking to Dr. Keith Crawford and Dr. Yolanda Lewis about clinical trials and, most importantly, why it's important for Black people to be involved in clinical trials. And so Brenda asked me in the comment section. She asked general in the comment section, where can I find out about clinical trials? I put one site in there, clinicaltrials.gov, that has a listing of all of the clinical trials that are currently underway in their area, whether they are sponsored with their government or they're privately owned. They have a listing of all the clinical trials. Why? Because they have to list them all. That is part of the reporting. You can't just have a clinical trial that's secret. You have to have it. There's a registry that you have to register. If you have any type of clinical trials, it has to be registered there. So you can find it all there at clinicaltrials.gov, and I will make sure I'll put that on the screen. So, and then you can search for it. And if there's something that's in your area, you can read all about it because they have to put all the information about it, and you don't have to even let them know your information. You could just find out about the clinical trial, and if you want to participate, then they have information on what you need to do to participate. So, Dr. Yolanda, you mentioned this earlier in terms of talking about Black participation in clinical trials on heart disease. And when I was researching this, I found out that in general, Black people only participate at about a 4 to 5% clip, and that's across all clinical trials. What's amazing about COVID trials is they upped that to about 10 to 15% participation with regards to the preparation of the COVID trials. And I would say, I think it was either Pfizer or Moderna that stopped their trials and waited to get more Black and brown people into the trial before they continued on, because they wanted to ensure its efficacy in Black and brown patients. And so, so I guess my question is, Dr. Crawford, what needs to be done to get more Black people involved? Because I know, I understand, I'm going to say, I want to be hypersensitive to, there is a real and genuine distrust of healthcare, and particularly when you hear clinical trials, because as we talked about earlier, clinical trials, Tuskegee, that's what word association. So how do we get over that distrust? How do we get more Black people to participate in clinical trials so we can get the added benefits, or maybe be able to determine if a medication is not the one that's for us? How do we do that for us?
So I think one of the ways that we do that, we can see right here on this screen with Dr. Lewis Ragland. And that's by having more Black researchers. We need more Black researchers doing clinical trials. Now, when I was on faculty in the College of Medicine at Howard University, most of my colleagues who were doing clinical trials were not African Americans, even for diseases that predominantly affected African Americans. So one of the ways we solve this is getting more African American clinicians to do clinical research. Yeah. Now, one reason why they might not do it is because, as she will tell you, and as I will tell you, it's hard work. Because the person who asked the question, oh, this clinical trial thing doesn't sound safe. Well, if you understood all the steps and all the stages and all the stuff we had to go through to make sure it was safe, then you might understand why a lot of physicians or other clinicians might say, you know what, no thanks. But if you're not doing clinical trials, you can refer. And African American physicians or nurse practitioners can refer their patients to clinical trials. Mm-hmm. Now, when I actually started out my career at the NIH. I did my clinical residency and training at the NIH. At that time, you had to have a physician referral to get into a clinical trial. It's not like that anymore, which I think is good because it expands the pool. But still, it's a really good idea for physicians to refer patients. And if you're a patient and you're thinking about a clinical trial, talk to your medical provider, talk to your physician, tell them, I'm thinking about this study. What do you think? Am I likely to benefit from this study? Is it likely to cause some harm? Talk to them about the study. And having sessions like this, educating people on what clinical trials are. One of the things that we have, I do a lot of HIV research. And when I was doing a lot of clinical trials, we have extensive clinical trial networks. These networks have advisory boards, community advisory boards. So these are the patients who are affected. And so these patients help us market our studies. And these patients give us advice on how to target this study to African Americans, how to recruit from the Latinx community for these types of studies. But one thing I will say as a barrier to African Americans and other minorities participating in clinical trials, and I saw this a lot when I was at Johns Hopkins working with the AIDS Clinical Trials Group, which is a large research network. It's actually a global research network. And a lot of the patients that I was trying to recruit in some of the clinical trials that I was doing, we have what are called in these clinical trials inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria.
Okay.
And so that means who gets in the study and who doesn't get in the study.
Right.
So now think about it. I have a drug to treat rheumatoid arthritis. It's a new drug. I think it works well, and I want to recruit African Americans into my study for rheumatoid arthritis. Okay, I've got rheumatoid arthritis. I want to go into the study. Well, you know what? We don't want people who have hypertension in the study. We don't want people who have diabetes in the study. We don't want people who have seizure disorders in the study. You're like, well, why don't they want them in there? Because we're trying to figure out if this drug works. We want as few factors that could confuse our interpretation of the data. When you start adding on other diseases and other medications and things that this person could be taking, it makes it more difficult for us to determine what the effect of this arthritis drug is. So I want people in my study who have as few of these other conditions as possible. Okay, because I want to get my drug approved. Now, after I get my drug approved, it's a different story. Because do people who have rheumatoid arthritis have high blood pressure? Yes, they do, a whole lot. And so once I get my drug approved, I want to make sure it's safe in people who have hypertension. And I want to make sure it's safe in people who have diabetes too. And I want to make sure it's used in as many different, but first and foremost, I got to get it approved for rheumatoid arthritis. And so if you have a lot of other medical conditions, you're taking a lot of other medications, you may get excluded from the study. And a lot of the patients that I was trying to recruit in some of our studies had exclusion factors. And they were either other medical conditions or other medications that they were taking that made them ineligible for a particular study. And so this is a barrier, and it makes people frustrated. It makes them, look, okay, I tried to get in a clinical trial. Every time I try to get in, they tell me I can't, I don't qualify and stuff. It makes people angry. But this is the reason why, and because we want to get the clearest answer to the question, does our drug work, or does this surgical procedure work, or does the transcendental meditation work? It may work to lower your blood pressure like Dr. Ragland's study, but if I've got all these other things going on, it might not work as effectively.
Or the other thing is, depending on what the medication, how it's metabolized, like Dr. Crawford said before, if this is a particular drug that's metabolized by the liver, and you have either liver issues or medications that prolong the liver metabolization or shortens it somehow, then that's going to be an exclusionary criteria, because the other medication that you have is is utilizing the very organ that is needed for this medication. So, people kind of think, well, it's just ibuprofen, or it's just that, but it could be that it's affecting the very organ that's metabolizes this particular medication. I also wanted to add to that, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in what he just said, right?
Right.
Here's the deal. We were just talking about clinical trials. Well, he knows this. There's a bias even in whether or not some people are able to do, there has been, at least historically. So we're starting to see more of us be allowed to do these trials, but it used to be your name had to be recognized. You had to be attached to some big Johns Hopkins, right? You had to be. And so if you're coming from a Meharry or a Howard, or, whatever, some small college where you have a lot of probably healthy Black individuals that you can put in your trial, but you can't get your trials, approved or in the study. Those are barriers that we've been also dealing with. And one of the things that you mentioned was, interestingly, I was at Howard. I was a medical student at Howard, did my residency at Howard. And the very people that were studying sickle cell were not Black.
Well, I can name who they are. I know who they are.
So my point is, they were not African American.
They were great researchers, but they weren't African American.
And they were Indian, right? They were East Indian. But even try to get people to trust, well, why at Howard University don't we have African American physicians or researchers studying even something like sickle cell, the one thing that you would think we would be very, on top of, and we would be. So it's so interesting to, as you're saying, some of the things that you're saying, to recognize that these biases are not even just about the participants. Some of those biases we've had to deal with in the scientific world to get into doing these studies, to be a part of the big picture, and again, to be at the table. So as you said, you got to have researchers that look like us, researchers that are trustworthy, and in terms of recruiting, you're most likely going to be recruited by your physician, or a physician that knows about the study, because I trust, they're doing this great study over at Hopkins or at Howard or whatever. Let me get you involved in that. And so, that is very interesting, because it's a lot to unpack.
I'm so glad you raised that point. Just quickly to follow up of just how important that is we fund the work that I do right now. We fund clinical research, and I have oversight roles on those clinical studies. And we look for HBCU applications, and we are begging good investigators. How do we get
But part of that is mentorship, right? Mentorship. That's the thing that what you were saying, that's something that you've done before. Some of it is you don't see a lot of people doing them because it is a lot of work. It's hard to get in, and you need the mentors that can say, hey, get into this and do this study. You would be great at this, or I think this is something that. So we just need to also be reaching out, and really mentorship, I think, is very important.
It's incredibly important.
I think that is such an interesting and very salient point, right? Because we got to talk about, how do people get into certain lines of work? Some people are just naturally curious, naturally drawn to it. But a lot of people have met somebody, had a family member, had a mentor that said, you know what, this would be, or even just a teacher that says, you know what, you've got a great mind for science and math or whatever. You might want to think about this career. Somebody helped you along the way to get to that point. Research is something that, like, I don't know any. You could pull together 30 kids and say, who wants to be a researcher? And I don't think anyone would say.
But Kizzy, right? Dr. Kizzy, now you have you now have people realizing, wait a minute.
Yes.
And as I say to people all the time, I was this weird I was that combination of the nerd who liked to party. So what I became was somebody who was very interested in how things worked. And so it wasn't until I met someone in I think my 7th or 8th grade year who was a biologist woman who let me realize you can actually do both. We have to see more of what we are, who we are, but I think that now little girls are starting to look at science differently. It's just like you see the first female pilot and you go, oh, wait a minute. Women can be pilots. So I think we do just need to start looking at and saying, hey, research. You should do research. That's another thing that we should also be trying. Everybody doesn't need to be a doctor, a lawyer, or a pilot. There's research. There's, podcasts. There's all kinds of stuff that we need to be telling our kids that they're capable of.
So we hear the catchphrase, representation matters. That's what we're talking about, because that representation, having Dr. Crawford there being a lead, is and looking for.
I mean, he's like,
from, because there's only 4 Black medical schools: Howard, Meharry, Charles Drew, and I'm drawing a blank on Morehouse. So we've got to go to these institutions. We got to say, hey, look, yes, we need more Black physicians. Absolutely, right? Black physicians only make up about 5% of the doctors in the country. We understand that. We got to grow that. But some of those physicians need to be researchers as well, so they can help develop medications and treatments and interventions that are going to be applicable not just only to Black people, but also can be effective for Black people. And say, hey, look, this one is really good because we had 15-20% of our trial group were people of color, and so therefore, and it showed to be effective across ethnic lines. And so this medication can be, so you put that information out to doctors that are out there practicing, you can say, this medication, you present your findings, this medication has proven to be effective across ethnic lines. And so they're going to be more apt to write that prescription versus one that you have to qualify and say, well, it didn't do that well in X population. And so the only way we can do that is by participation.
Well, at the NIH, we dangle a carrot for people who may be going on to do their medical residencies. And if you come to the NIH and you're going to do an intensive residency, which integrates research, and then you do a research fellowship after that, they'll pay your school loans from your medical school tuition.
Look, I'm writing this down because I know plenty of people. No, seriously, I know plenty. You're always being asked to mentor. So I know a lot of young people who think they want to go to medical school, and I think this is a great thing to know and a great program. And I wanted to add to the answer earlier. Then you said, how can we get more people? I think we also have to remember, where are we, right? Where are we? We're in certain places. We're in churches. We're in organizations. One of the ways that you find some folks that aren't necessarily, they don't have a lot of comorbidities yet, or maybe universities, right? Maybe fraternities, sororities, organizations. We have to start kind of thinking out of the box and talking to talking to us where we are, because you can also do a lot of education in these areas, right? In churches and in universities and schools and organizations. So I think that we do have to figure out exactly what you're saying. We do have to figure out how to get us interested. I remember being at school. I did undergrad at Stanford and Santa Clara. I remember being at school, and there were a lot of the white students that were in trials. I didn't trial. What kind of trial? Like, what are you doing? And incentives for them. They get paid or not a lot of money, but something small or enough to get food. Now they're Amazon card. In fact, we were given Clin cards and Amazon cards to be a part of this study for the TM, because you got to incentivize. But I remember thinking, well, what is that? But it was never anything that I knew to be interested in. But their peer group that's something that they kind of knew that they could be a part of it. So I do think that we just need to do a little bit more of that, talking to universities, talking to our churches, talking to whatever organizations that we can talk to get them to recognize that we need to be a part of these clinical trials.
And let me, if I could make another point. I know you've got something important to say, but this is important as well, because we talk about clinical trials. At the beginning, I said a clinical trial is an intervention, and we talked about that. And Dr. Ragland gave her excellent examples of what her intervention is and stuff. But there is clinical research that is not a clinical trial. It's a clinical research because it uses human participants. It collects data, but it doesn't give you any intervention. And some of these studies are very important studies. Let me give you an example. Okay. Let's just say that you are a survivor of COVID. And the hospital that you got treated at said, okay, we're doing a cohort study of COVID survivors. You're like, well, what is that? What do I get? So we want to study how your body reacts after you've had COVID. What happens to the antibody? Do you get reinfected? What happens after you get vaccinated? You're like, oh, well, what do I have to do in this study? You really don't have to do anything. Come in every 2 months, fill out a questionnaire, and let us collect some blood from you. I say, well, can I get vaccinated? You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. We just want to follow you. And so this study enrolls people who have had COVID. It tracks them over time. Some of them didn't get vaccinated. Some of them did get vaccinated. Some got Pfizer, some got Moderna, some got Johnson & Johnson. Some got reinfected.
Right.
Some died. So we're just collecting the data, and we can take those, whether it's blood samples, nasopharyngeal swabs, and we can analyze that data, and we can learn a lot. And this question that came up, for those of you who may not know, we were actually in another session last night talking about COVID, but understanding how much antibody gives you protection. Nobody's been able to tell us that. We have antibody tests, but we don't know how it correlates to clinical outcomes. A study like this could give you the answer, because you can just look and see, okay, here are the antibody levels. We have everybody's antibody level. Who got COVID and who didn't? And how does that correlate with their antibody level? And how does that correlate with those who got vaccinated? And we can look at all of these things. So this is a clinical study that is going to be very, very helpful, but you're not giving in. You may say, I don't want to be a guinea pig. Well, you're not going to be a guinea pig.
You're already a guinea pig. You just, this is what people don't realize. You're a guinea pig, but no one's studying what's going on with you. So no matter what you've experienced, there could be a study done, right? And so to finish up that point is the things that we can tell you. This is why we can tell you that long haulers have brain fog. This is why we can tell you that, after COVID, you may have hypertension. Even if you've never had hypertension before, it's very likely that this is going to be a sequelae. This is why we can tell you that people who never had diabetes before can actually get diabetes or some kind of, increased hemoglobin A1C after COVID. These are the reasons we know this is because people who, after they got COVID, agreed to be a part of a study where all we did was observe what's going on in your body. And now guess what? We know about myocarditis. It's not just this thing that happened with the vaccine. It's actually something that happened with the virus, and it's more common with the virus. And so the one that happens with the virus is worse than the one that happens that's mild with the vaccine. But if we had not studied these people, we would be thinking it's something that only happens with the vaccine. Well, that's
Right.
not true. And so this is why we need clinical research that's actually not a trial, but just following along to see how people do after something happens.
Yeah. Observational studies, we sometimes call them.
And absolutely right. So what Dr. Crawford talked about at our conversation last night, it's really about those people, especially people that are vaccinated, right? And then if they have that breakthrough COVID, if you took a sample of their antibodies at that time, over time, you do that with enough people, unvaccinated people, vaccinated people, when they got COVID, test their antibodies, where they are, test it later on, you could find that range of antibody levels that you need to be able, that are more effective in terms of protecting it against COVID. You can't do that without trials. You can't do that without studies. You can't do that without research. So we need everybody to participate, because we don't know that level might be higher or lower depending upon your ethnicity. It might be higher or lower depending upon your age. It might be higher or lower depending upon your gender. So there are multiple factors that could play into how COVID, even on that one illness, and diabetes and hypertension, this could be applicable across many illnesses. But all of it comes back to, we have to do some clinical trials, we have to do some studies, and we have to participate. So I'm going to put on the screen here the website, clinicaltrials.gov. I mentioned it earlier. If you need any information about any clinical trials that are going on right now, if you just want to know about it, go to clinicaltrials.gov. If you want to know about what ones that are going on in your area to get involved in, go to clinicaltrials.gov. If you have a medical school in your area, go there. I'm sure there's something going on at any point in time. At every medical school in this country, there are some sort of trial that's being run, connected at any time. So please. I don't want to thank everybody that gave us some really great encouragement. I'm going to put this on the screen because I want people to recognize, because yes, we had some great questions, but people are really encouraging us, and I want to just, these kind of messages really help fuel that passion that you see from each one of us on the screen. These are the messages that help fuel us, because it is hard work. Dr. Crawford can tell you, he does it every day.
And I've done clinical trials in Africa as well. So yeah, it's hard. And by the way, Dr. Lewis Ragland, you will probably cringe when you hear this, but when we were trying to get our trials through Kenya, we had to go through 3 IRBs.
Oh Lord. Yes, and that's stringent.
Yes.
But it's so, and what I love about that, and people need to hear it, because the first thing they think is they're going over there and studying people, and those people don't know, like we're taking advantage. We're really not. We're trying to get interventions to them that we may already have. But again, IRB is like, let's prove it. Prove that you're not taking advantage, and prove that you have folks that their language isn't going to be a barrier. Their culture is not going to be a barrier. Trust me. I told you, I lived in Africa for a couple of years. I did Peace Corps. So I know that we're very serious about making sure we're not trying to exploit anybody, take advantage of anybody. And so I really do appreciate, as hard as they are, as meticulous as they are, I really appreciate IRB. So yeah,
absolutely. So just in summary tonight, we have learned what are clinical trials. We have talked about informed consent and why it's informed. We talked some about Tuskegee and the impact, and while the study itself was completely horrendous, there has been some tremendous positive things that's happened as a result of that becoming to light, in terms of having IRBs and being more stringent, and people being able to say, you know what, I don't want to be a part of this trial anymore. You can step out at any time. They've got to let you know what's going on. So there are really some great strides that have been made since 1972. I believe that's when that particular study was exposed. We also talked about there's a lot of social determinants as to why more people of color aren't participating in clinical trials. We talked about exclusion and inclusionary measures as a part of clinical trials. There is a lot that we have to unpack here, so we're probably going to have to revisit this at some point in the future. But thank you both for coming tonight. You all are part of my special group of people that I need to call on. Guys, like, you're so knowledgeable and you're so passionate, and you do such a wonderful job of being able to explain it to help folks like us, the lay folks, understand the importance of it and give it to it in a way that it makes sense. So I want to thank both of you for being part of this discussion tonight. And I look forward to speaking to everybody, and thank everybody for watching, hanging out with us. We're going to re-air this again in the morning so you can see it again. Thank you, Beverly, for that. Thank you, Denise. We're going to re-air this again in the morning. So, so tag some friends, share it with friends, share it on your page if you can. It's going to be on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Share this information so we can get more Black and brown people involved in clinical trials.
And more women.
That was non-gender specific, Doctor.
No, I know, but I think women don't realize how few of us are willing to, and sometimes after pregnancy, so many things will happen. So we have to remember that we're underrepresented, and so we definitely have to think about being a part of trials. So.
Absolutely. So thank you all, and we will see you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you for having us.